Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're going to allow a few extra minutes for people to arrive and get things started here momentarily. Hello to those that are joining. We're just going to allow a minute or two here for people to arrive, and then we'll get started. All righty, 9:02. A few people still trickling in, but I think we can kick things off. Good morning, welcome. Thanks for being with us today. My name is Dylan Waldhuter. I'm with the Water Council, and I'm joined today by Greg Gasper with WMEP and WSBC. We'll tell you a bit more about ourselves and about our organizations in a moment. Today, the webinar is really going to focus on water risk management. We'll take a look at it from a kind of macro global perspective, but then funnel in on really the Midwest and Wisconsin and the different water risks that exist as an introduction to a conversation with the way we manage water resources. So we're going to have a conversation about traditional water management and how we can transition away from the management of the resource that's solely focused on efficiency and conservation, but to evolve towards more of a water stewardship aligned approach. And we'll talk about what that means. We'll talk about different ways to do that and kind of conclude with ways that we might be able to support you in that journey. So today's webinar is Midwest Water Risk Management, developing a strategy that holds water. Again, my name is Dylan Waldhuter. I'm the Director for Water Stewardship Solutions at the Water Council. I've been with the Water Council since 2016, working on water stewardship. Greg Gasper is the co-panelist today. He's the Director for Environmental and Sustainability Services and has a role within WMEP and WSBC. And he'll be able to tell you a bit more about himself and his organization in a moment. For those that aren't familiar with the Water Council's a global hub dedicated to solving critical water challenges by driving innovation in freshwater technology and advancing water stewardship. So in the Water Council's early days, it was really hyper-focused on the innovation piece and fostering water technology development to solve the world's water problems. In 2016, the Water Council evolved and took on a new remit to work towards water stewardship, recognizing that the management of the resource was really important for technologies to be meaningfully adopted and applied. And so in 2016, the Alliance for Water Stewardship, which is an international nonprofit, was establishing regional partnerships all over the globe. And the Water Council became the North American regional partner for the Alliance for Water Stewardship from 2016 to 2021. At the end of last year, we pivoted away from that official relationship. The Alliance for Water Stewardship's work was really hyper-focused on site level operational water stewardship. And they also evolved a bit to get away from the regional coverage to focus more on a sector-based approach. So our new evolution means that we are working more comprehensively within the world of water stewardship, really supporting businesses in their water stewardship journey, not only at that site level, but really from the boardroom to the shop floor, from the enterprise level strategy all the way down to operationalizing water stewardship good practices. And so we do that through 3 key water stewardship programs now. We have advisory services that we offer businesses where we meet them wherever they are in their journey to develop an engagement that's beneficial to the organization. We do some capacity building and training where we can support organizations in building internal capacity for water stewardship adoption, again, from really the enterprise or corporate level all the way down to the site. And then we also have our new WAVE Water Stewardship Verified program, which I'll tell you more about shortly, but it's a new program that we have that is really intended to fill a gap between enterprise level commitments and strategies, and then the operational aspects of water stewardship. So how do we build a bridge from committing to wanting to do something about water stewardship and then accelerating to a point where we're actually taking meaningful action in water stewardship? And that's where this WAVE program comes in. It offers third-party verification for companies to be able to communicate credibly to stakeholders and investors that they have a process in place to meaningfully address water resources from a risk perspective. And so I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. Greg, do you want to talk quickly about WMEP and WSBC?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dylan. Again, I'm Greg Gasper. I'm the Director of Environmental and Sustainability Services for WMEP and WSBC. Been with the organization shade over 8 years and spent majority of my time working in sustainability and water stewardship. So happy to be with you here today to talk a little bit about water stewardship and a little bit about WMEP and WSBC. WMEP is an affiliate of the National Institutes of Standards and Technology MEP network. And what that is it's a network of 59 different units scattered across each of the states of the union that provides assistance to manufacturers and businesses for services that they might not be able to afford or be able to secure on their own. WSBC is an affiliate of WMEP. WMEP acquired WSBC a couple of years back, and what WSBC does is it advances the sustainability principles for businesses and helping them to be able to establish business credentials and working towards programs and education such as the Green Masters program and 21st Century Pathways. So WMEP has a long relationship with the Water Council, started back in 2015 when WMEP was a founding member of the Water Council's role for the Alliance for Water Stewardship. And we stayed with the Water Council through their time together with AWS through the end of last year. We've also been co-providing AWS training for North America since its inception until the pivot to the WAVE program here. We've also supported their water stewardship implementers and co-developed water stewardship implementation and validation tools such as calculators, checklists, templates, any type of documentation that can help companies to be able to more quantify and structure their water stewardship program. We've also been involved with the WAVE development with the Water Council. So as you can see, we've been, great partners throughout the Alliance for Water Stewardship era from 2015 to 2021, and looking forward, we're going to continue our relationship with the Water Council by co-developing new training for water stewardship, developing these webinars that you're going through today here, and also coordinating water stewardship support for businesses and manufacturers going forward.
So
go ahead. Go ahead,
I'll cover this piece. Just to cover quickly the agenda for today, before we kick things off, we're going to cover at a high level what water risk looks like and means across the globe in the United States, but then we really want to funnel down and have a conversation with regard to especially the different water quantity and quality risks that exist in Wisconsin and the Midwest. And so we'll rely on some examples from Wisconsin and from some work that Greg did in Iowa to take a look at those risks. That'll give us the ingredients for a conversation with regard to how those water risks ultimately impact businesses, and then talk about the different approaches that businesses can take to be responsive to those water related risks. So we'll talk about what traditional water management has looked like in the past, and then we'll talk about water stewardship and how it offers a new way of thinking about water and an approach that really does more meaningfully address the water related risks and challenges that exist for businesses. We'll then offer some tangible strategies, goals, actions, different things that businesses can do at both the enterprise level and in their operations to adopt water stewardship. And then we'll conclude with some Q&A. Final logistic point, if you do have questions, we invite them throughout. Please use the Q&A functionality in the webinar to submit those questions. We'll review them and then we will cover them at the conclusion of the presentation today.
So when we talk about water risk, when we start looking at it from a global standpoint, there's obviously some issues that are out there. And some of these are, 3.5 billion people live in areas that experience water scarcity, and that's expected to increase to 5 billion in just the next 30 years. So people are going to start to be affected more and more with regards to water. More than 1.2 billion people are at risk of floods. Well, I'll talk a little bit about some flooding we had in Madison a couple of years back as we go forward in today's slide deck. One of the key ones that I think is really important is the 80% of the world's wastewater is returned to the environment untreated. So we have, a majority of this water that we're using it for our utility is going back in, but it's not being treated as it's being returned to the environment. Over 3 billion people don't have hand washing facilities in their home. That's a risk that needs to be addressed at some point in time, and it's got to be addressed sooner than later. And then we start to see the species, the different types of flora and fauna that are affected by water risk. And, we see that there's been a decline since 1970 of, these species and are dying out as a result of some of this stuff. So, obviously there's risk out there for all of us. And how do we mitigate some of that risk, and how do we deal with it to leave this place a better place for our children and leave a better legacy? When we start to look at water risk, as this is a tool that's available, it's a free tool out there that you could access. It's through a WRI aqueduct. As you can see on the left-hand side, this is the United States, looking at it from today. This is the baseline today. So you can see the water stress areas. The extremely high ones are the dark red area. So as you see that, you can see the Great Lakes region, not too, not as bad as the southwestern part of the United States. So you're thinking, well, we're pretty good. When we start to look at the modeling of what that looks like in another 8 years, you see the Great Lakes turns from the yellows from the low to low medium to the high to the extremely high. So we've got some issues here in the Great Lakes region, and as well as the rest of the United States. It's gotten a lot redder than it has been, today, and it will continue to get that way until we can figure out ways to address that. How do we contribute to maybe slowing that pace down or reducing it altogether? So what today we're going to talk about, we're going to spend a majority of our time. While these 5 points here are really important, we're going to spend majority of the presentation talking about water quantity and water quality. So those are the two areas that we want to really focus in on today, because here in the Midwest, typically we think we have an abundance of water. We have the Great Lakes. They're not too far away from all of us here, but we have some issues with water quality, and we need to make sure that we understand what those risks are.
So when we talk about water risk, there are kind of these 4 or 5 broad categories of water risk. And so that's not to say that infrastructure risks aren't relevant to the Midwest. We definitely know that they are. Infrastructure is deteriorating. It's typically public and shared, seems to be out of our control, but definitely something to monitor. And then we'll talk a little bit about how these water quantity and quality and infrastructure risks ultimately do present some regulatory risk as regulations change with regard to water, become more volatile, and also potentially reputational risk with the way that we're using the resource, and how that might lead to some reputational damage to our business. So we'll talk about those pieces as well.
So let's start with water quantity. As Dylan mentioned, I was involved with a large project with Iowa State University, and also a large retail convenience store operation, and helping them establish water stewardship credentials based in Iowa. And one of the things that we found, so you'll see a lot of examples of Iowa, but whether it's Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, you name it, any state in the nation, there's probably instances, and it probably looks very similar to what we're going to be talking about today. So while I'm referencing Iowa, note that your location, is pretty much going to be the same as well. So if you look at the slide, the picture on the right, that's the decline in water levels in one of the aquifers between 2004 and 2013. So they've really drawn down. The purple tells that they've drawn down just a little bit less than 10 feet. But if you start to see those greens, browns, and oranges, they're going down, they're drawing down 60, 40 to 50 to 60 feet of water. So, they're really having to get down to that aquifer. They're getting down lower and lower. So those water levels are really reducing, in Iowa with that particular aquifer. And then we can look at Wisconsin. We have some issues there with high capacity wells affect that little Plover River in the middle part of the state. When people are utilizing that water for irrigation, it makes the little Plover River disappear. Essentially, it just becomes a dry creek bed. So there's obviously issues that, we can have issues with not having enough water, and that's the case in these two instances here. We also conversely can have too much water. I mentioned earlier, we had flooding in Dane County, and this was, just a couple of years ago. So, and that's where I'm located. So, you can deal with having too much water at a time. And one of the things that we noted when we were doing our work with Iowa State was, the number of heavy downpours in Iowa has increased from 1950 to 2020. It's on an upward trend, and approximately 123,000 properties have a 20% chance of some amount of water reaching their actual buildings in 2022 here. So there's some state data showing that you can get too much water, and there's really, when we were looking at Iowa and setting this up with our client, there's more than 150,000 people living in areas at an elevated risk of flooding. So Iowa isn't as heavily populated as some other areas, but these people are affected by having too much water. So how do we be able to mitigate some of those risks? What can we do to, we can't really stop the rain from coming, but how can we, do some things, to be able to mitigate some of that type of those types of events? Let's talk about water quality from the groundwater perspective. Here in Wisconsin, you can start to see on the left-hand side, there's nitrates in the drinking water around Wisconsin. So the dark red areas are the ones that show, higher amounts, where we're starting to see these higher amounts of nitrates in our drinking water. So this really affects us. The same thing in Iowa. You can see where, a majority of the state has poor water quality. At some point in time, people are going to have to, by bottling in or bringing in water or bringing in bottled water or bringing in water in some fashion to be able to satisfy, the citizens' requirements for water. So we've got some issues with water quality that we need to really be able to start addressing and figure out how we can clean those up so we can, trust the water that's coming out when we turn the faucet. We also have issues with water quality from surface water, and this should hit home for those of you who are from Wisconsin. 92 new waters have been identified as impaired, so that really has doubled since 2008. So just in 15 years, we've doubled the amount of waters that are impaired here in Wisconsin. So, while we have great abundance of some water and have the Great Lakes that, very close to us, our water quality definitely is not where it needs to be. And we need to do something to rectify how we can contribute to hoping to and working to improve that water quality here in Wisconsin. So really, when we start to look at these water risks, how does this equate to a business? We talked about some things, and we can see where it might affect us personally, but how does it affect us as a business? Well, there's four main risks of water for business or for water. We talked about quantity and quality, and then Dylan kind of mentioned it earlier in the slide: source water health, and then community perceptions. So those are the four main risks for water. But then when you consequently, when you look at it from a business risk, we look at it four main ways. There's a physical risk. One, we might not have the water we need for our operations when we need it. There could be a reputational risk where somebody thinks that we're using too much, or we're not being good stewards of that particular resource. There could be a regulatory risk where we might be doing something that's harming the environment because of some of the things that we're doing operationally or organizationally to that water. And then there's also that financial risk. If we don't have water for some of our operations or for our business, we're going to, it might cut into profits because we have to secure water in alternative methods or ways that we don't currently do. So you can start to see how those risks play out from a business standpoint, and think about that from your organization's perspective. What are some of the risks if we didn't have water when we needed it? What would be that impact? How might we be able to mitigate some of that stuff? Hopefully these questions will start to be popping up, and we can talk more about that during the Q&A process of how you might be able to address some of that. So we look at the water risks and adjusted returns. What I want to show here is, typically, we graph, what we're doing here is really showing what is, how do we look at things typically. So this bottom line, the light blue line, is typically what you'd see in a company that just looks at the cost of water coming into the facility. So if you're looking for a return on investment there, obviously you'd say, well, it's a long payback. But let's look at that upper line, that upper darker line, and really that factors in water scarcity, additional treatment of costs for that water to be able to be produced, for chemicals and equipment that might be needed to process that water, and then maintenance on the equipment. And when you look at water recovery and reuse and those other factors such as reputation and availability, obviously that risk adjustment, it magnifies it much more quickly. And for the organization, this is for the organization that we were working with in Iowa, they really had a 25-year investment that paid for itself in about 2.5 years, because of taking a look at those different aspects and looking at those factors to be able to say, hey, you know what, we can't afford to not do this. So, to turn that 25-year investment, if you were looking at it from the bottom to where you're looking at it, in the top line, makes some sense. So you got to take a look at it from a much different lens to be able to, show what that risk potentially could be.
So these water risks, they do have material impacts on businesses. Greg covered the importance of starting to think beyond sort of the input-output costs associated with water, but really to think more broadly about the value that water offers and the different risks that could adjust the way that you think about the cost or price of water. Let's look at some macro level kind of business statistics with regard to the way that water risks have manifested. The first bullet here is from a CDP report. This is a popular reporting entity where they get a lot of good data with regard to different environmental considerations, water being one of them. In their 2019 report, the businesses that were reporting to CDP, which is not all businesses, reported a combined value at risk of $425 billion. That's a huge number, and that's significantly underreported, again, because not all businesses report to CDP. So that's just of the businesses reporting to CDP. The year previously, they took a look specifically at how water risks were actually leading to losses for businesses. And again, those reporting companies reported $38.5 billion in actual losses in 2018. So we can see that monetarily, water risks are leading to bottom line impacts for businesses. When we talk about what businesses are doing about these water-related risks, the CDP reports offer us some additional data. In that 2018 report, 77% of companies reported that there was some exposure to substantive water risks, but only 29% of them had set specific water targets or goals to be responsive to those risks. Now, encouragingly, in the 2020 report 2 years later, 65% of companies reported conducting water risk assessments, but in that 2020 report, 59% of reporting companies had set specific water targets or goals. So while the companies could be a little different from 2018 to 2020, it does show a trend that more companies are starting to think about water risks and how those water risks are impacting their business, and they're taking actual action to set specific water targets and goals to be responsive to those risks. So we're going to get into some of that today. The final bullet here is looking at this trend in environmental social governance. And this is really a telling statistic. Bloomberg estimates that $50 trillion in ESG assets by 2025. That's a 33% of global total assets under management. So a 30% annual growth in the last 5 years. This is a really important trend. Investors are really focused on ESG, and they're looking for companies to do more with regard to how they're managing different environmental factors, which is inclusive of water. So funneling down, how do these water risks ultimately impact businesses from kind of a cost perspective? On the water quality side of things, it could mean that our incoming water quality isn't as good as we need it to be. It could mean that our discharges, we need to meet a higher level of treatment before returning it to the sewage treatment plant and or the environment. So we could find ourselves needing newer, less contaminated sources of water. We could need to do some expensive treatment, either on the incoming water or on our effluent, things like increased raw water polishing or treatment of incoming water, like I said. And all of this can ultimately present some risks with regard, again, to reputational damage and or lead to some volatility with the way that regulations work related to water resources. On the scarcity side of things, we could have not enough water. We could learn that our use of the water resource and our withdrawal or consumption is having a material impact on the watershed that we operate in. And so this could lead to needing to dig deeper for groundwater. As that's drawn down, it could lead to us needing to seek alternate sources of water resources. It could lead to us needing to invest in some expensive technology to be more efficient. Again, the way that we use water from a quantity perspective can also present some risks related to reputation and can also lead to some volatility in regulation. So what we want to do is understand how is our business using water? What are the conditions of the watershed that we're operating in related to quality and scarcity? And how do those ultimately impact our business? And what can we do to be resilient or responsive to those risks? So we're going to talk about some of that. This can all ultimately lead to some business disruption, could lead to mandated conservation or reduction, could lead to more stringent management of effluent and discharge. So just note that these different water risks can materially impact the business, even if you're not seeing that right now. That doesn't mean that you're immune to these sorts of risks materializing for you in the future. So we want to become aware of them and be proactive with regard to how we consider water risks. There's supply chain considerations, could lead to outsourcing. We talked about some of the infrastructure and regulatory controls in the Midwest. Agricultural runoff and stormwater are top contributors to the different water quality challenges that we have. So that can certainly be a factor. And even conflict management, right? We don't think about that a lot, but I think the Great Lakes Compact here in Wisconsin and some of the challenges that Waukesha had a few years back in getting access to some of the Great Lakes water and other interbasin transfer issues all over the US and in other parts of the Midwest are things that we need to be thinking about. But it's not just risk and cost, right? There's some value and opportunity in this as well. A study from a large company found that its average true cost of water was 2.5 times more than the purchase cost. So thinking back to the chart that Greg showed, if you start to think about this from more of a value perspective, it starts to make the business case stronger, which can lead to enhanced efforts with regard to water and water stewardship. So lots of companies are doing this now. They're establishing an internal price on water that's taking into account the social and environmental costs, but also opportunities that exist. There's other studies in certain regions of the world that suggest that, for cubic meters of water conserved, it delivers some additional benefit through avoided environmental damage. This specific statistic is from Australia, showing a $6 return. That's really great to see. Looking to some more company level data, there were 58 companies that mentioned water risk in their 2020 SEC filings, which was up from 41 in the previous year. I would expect to see that continue to increase over time as climate change evolves and more abundant rain events occur and drought and extended periods of drought. These water risks will continue to materialize for businesses. Then we can look at earnings, right? Water related impacts can have real impact on earnings, both from a risk perspective, but also from a value perspective. And finally, I think from a value perspective, there's a real opportunity for companies to align their brand with the purpose. And that purpose can be water stewardship, right? So it's not just about the different risk factors, but also thinking about how the company can be strategic from an opportunity perspective to demonstrate leadership in water and water stewardship and what that could ultimately mean for the value of the business. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what can we do and what are the approaches to mitigating water-related risk and taking advantage of different water-related opportunities. And I think when we talk about traditional water management, what we've seen and what the current state is in a lot of industries and sectors is that water management, traditional water management efforts have been very focused on conservation and efficiency. They're very withdrawal reduction aligned, and they don't always take into account the broader water-related risks and impacts that we've discussed: water quality, infrastructure, regulatory risk, reputational risk. And so what we want to do is kind of break the mold of this traditional water management to think more holistically about the different risks that exist, to think about how is my business materially impacted by how we use water, and let those in that context sort of inform the action that we take.
Dylan, one thing I want to add here that I think is important for the participants or attendees here today to understand is a lot of this information we gathered from our work with over 200 companies doing these types of sustainability development here at WMEP. And, typically what you start to see is people need to start looking past some of these, things that, should be expected. So if we start looking at if we're focusing, we've been focusing on water management, well, that's been great. We got to take it to that next level. And what we've seen is, some companies, their water stewardship efforts were just making sure that the water bill got paid, not really even looking at their operations to see where might there be some gaps, where might there be some issues. And traditional water management, they didn't even realize that when we had a client that we worked with that, was getting 90% of their tomatoes for the tomato paste that they would make for their frozen pizzas were coming from the Central Valley of California. They didn't realize, those potential risks out there. If there's some sort of a disruption in Central California with their tomatoes, they wouldn't be making their pizzas. So, it's having sometimes those discussions and thinking, just taking that step back and taking that thought will take you from some of these traditional water management concepts to what Dylan's going to talk a little bit more about is water stewardship. Where can our organization take ourselves from where we've been to where we'd like to be?
So you've probably seen goals and targets and commitments from companies in all sectors that look something like we commit to reducing our overall water usage by a certain percentage by a certain year, or we're implementing some percentage withdrawal reduction target. And these are great, important initiatives, and we're not here to suggest that conserving or water or reducing withdrawals is a bad thing. But again, this is more traditional water management. We want to drive towards thinking about how we manage the water resource more holistically and differently. So reduction in efficiency should be a piece of a broader strategy to ensure that we're accounting for our water risks and challenges, and that we are implementing contextual targets that are responsive to those that are most material to the way that we use the resource and the watershed that we operate in. So we're offering a new water management approach. Water stewardship, when it's applied, is a great way of thinking about this. And so I think other categories of environmental management that have been really high priority over the last decade plus have led to this water reduction emphasis, right? With energy and greenhouse gas and carbon and packaging and waste, reduction is a logical strategy, right? Carbon is fungible. You can reduce a pound of carbon in Milwaukee and it has an impact on global carbon emissions. But water is very different, right? It's local in the way that its challenges manifest. The challenges are very diverse. It's a shared resource. And so while reduction of water use is important, and especially important in water scarce or water quantity risky environments, these diverse, complex, local shared characteristics of water means that we need to approach it differently. And so water stewardship offers us an approach that goes beyond, it's inclusive of conservation and efficiency, but addresses water more holistically. So what does water stewardship look like? Water stewardship is going to encompass this contextual management of the water resource. So it goes beyond the traditional water management kind of input-output approach, but to look at the resource as something that's an important input to our production, but has these other value elements as well. And so what we're driving towards is for companies to have a process of developing, optimizing, planning for, and integrating water-related risks and opportunities into their company strategy, policy, practices, stakeholder engagement, regulatory management systems. So it's evolving to water targets and goals and policies at a company that, again, could be inclusive of some efficiency goal, but really are something closer to, we've prioritized our water risks and we're developing and implementing contextual water management plans or targets in our highest X% operations. This is what we really ultimately want to drive towards with regard to ensuring that our business is understanding, prioritizing our water-related risks, and then implementing meaningful strategies, targets, goals to be responsive to those risks. Water stewardship offers us a methodology for understanding the context of the site, as well as the watershed that site or our site is operating in. So what are the conditions of the watershed and how does that impact our business? If we are a really intensive user of water resources and we are in a watershed that is really water scarce, right, from a quantity perspective, then our risk is pretty high, right? We're really dependent on the resource. We use a lot of it, and our watershed doesn't have a ton of availability. Conversely, if we're not a major user of the resource and we're in Milwaukee on the shores of Lake Michigan, the resource itself is very abundant, then maybe that quantity risk is a bit lower. Scarcity is not our primary issue, but maybe there's a water quality related concern, or maybe there's an infrastructure concern. And can we better align our efforts and resources with the risks that are most material and impactful to the way that we do business at a site within the context of the watershed that we're operating in? So good water stewardship is inclusive of things like proactive stakeholder engagement, again, at that site level. Really important for a company to understand the stakeholder governance that exists within their watershed that could impact the site. They can be great sources of data and information with regard to the water-related challenges and initiatives that are in place. Water stewardship is going to offer us a lens to look at value and move beyond just thinking about costs, but to consider externalities that are associated with water resources. It offers us a way to expand our scope to address things like environmental social governance. So can we demonstrate to external stakeholders that we're not just conserving water resources, but that we're taking a meaningful approach to responding to water-related risks? So this water stewardship approach is what we're really driving towards. So how do we do this? Well, it's important that we have some relationship between our enterprise goals and strategy and then our operational water stewardship, right? So what does that mean? It probably means at the enterprise or corporate level that we've done some assessment of risk of our portfolio of sites or of our site, depending on the size of the company, that we've done some prioritization of those different risks, and then that we've set some enterprise level strategy or policy to be responsive to those risks. That will ultimately lead to then the operational components. So that policy should define how sites implement water stewardship meaningfully. And so that can look like site-specific assessment of water use in the watershed that site operates in. It can look like, watershed scale engagement of stakeholders, the definition then of contextual actions that can be taken at that site level to be responsive to those risks, and then some implementation of those risks. So all this to say, there's these multiple scales of water stewardship from sort of the boardroom enterprise level down to the shop floor operational level. And so Greg and I are going to offer you some different ways to think about implementing water stewardship at these two scales, and then maybe a bit about how we can support you in your journey should you require it. At the enterprise scale, or at the business level, what are some ways to adopt and address water stewardship? Well, it's really important to think about the materiality of water resources and how you're using the resource. Not only is water material to my business, but how is it material, right? Just about every business relies on water in some way, even if it's just commercial office buildings where the people in the building need clean drinking water and sanitation. It's really important from that enterprise scale to get some understanding of what risk looks like, either in your direct operations or your supply chain and then do some prioritization of that risk, right? Which risks are most material to my business? Which sites within my portfolio of sites are of greatest exposure to water-related risks? And then based on our understanding of the risks and opportunities that exist, can we develop some enterprise level strategy and policy to inform how we approach water at an operational scale? There's also some important considerations with regard to disclosure and reporting. How do we credibly communicate what we're doing on water resources to stakeholders in a way that's really meaningful? So what are some actions that your organization can take? Well, conducting a materiality assessment is really an important place to begin, thinking about, again, how does water material impact my business? How do we use water? Conducting some high-level risk assessments. You can leverage some globally available tools like the WRI, World Resources Institute Aqueduct. The WWF Water Risk Filter is another useful tool for conducting some of these high-level risk assessments. Gives you an idea of how the watershed conditions might ultimately impact your different operations from a water risk perspective. Again, the prioritization then of risk is really important to think about informing the actions that you're going to take and the strategy that you might develop. The development of a water strategy and policy can be really important at that enterprise level. And then thinking about how to improve communications to proactively disclose, tell your story with regard to your water stewardship efforts. I want to highlight the WAVE program here, right? So again, the Water Council has this new program, WAVE, Water Stewardship Verified. It's really intended to accelerate water stewardship within an organization. So to take a company that's sort of transitioning from traditional water management to water stewardship and wants to accelerate to kind of get from 0 to 60 to build a bridge from intention to implementation, the WAVE offers a continual improvement methodology for doing so. At the conclusion of the implementation of the WAVE framework, the company that implements it can then be third-party verified to demonstrate to external stakeholders that they have credibly implemented a process of water stewardship for understanding their water-related risks and then developing action plans to be responsive to those risks. So we're really excited about this program. We've piloted it with a few companies, and we rolled this out last month and have a ton of interest already. So if this is something that you're interested in, please let us know. We'd be happy to talk to you more about it to determine if it's a good fit for your business. And that's the seal that comes with WAVE verification.
So we talked about, Dylan did a great job looking at it from the enterprise. I'm going to talk a little bit from the operational side, but know that both are predicated on the ISO premise of a plan, do, check, act. So we start to look at things from a more methodical approach, and some ways that you might be able to do that operationally is engage with your engineering group to understand where there might be some opportunities in your process or your activities that you're doing operationally to see where you can do some things, because many companies don't really know their pain points for water, but working with engineering can provide some insight to, so how you might handle some stormwater, water treatment, or water use or discharge methodologies. Maybe you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. Maybe you should be doing something you're not. So, start to talk and have those discussions and get more collaborative in some of the things that we're talking about. And I'll talk about collaboration here in a second. Design support, it's not only design of your processes, but also look at design of your product, and looking at it from that product life cycle as well. So if you produce some things, how are we designing things operationally to ensure that we're, addressing water and being using water to its most efficient capabilities. And then ultimately, really one of the key ones that we focus in on with our clients a lot is that supply chain. I just mentioned that pizza manufacturer that, didn't really realize how much, they had invested in one particular geographical region. So working with your supply chain can certainly help you to be able to address some operational water issues and to help you identify where there might be some risks that you might be able to mitigate, or, we look at things to, try to do things differently to, enhance some of the good things that are happening out there as well. So, but as I shared earlier, the risk for businesses are physical, reputational, regulatory, and financial. And I think what we've seen as we've worked with our clients, we really almost need to add another one, and it's collaborative risk. And what we categorize collaborative risk as is opportunities not realized because you're not really able to articulate your water expectations effectively with your supply chain customers. When we work with companies, we're trying to help them be able to craft that message that Dylan was mentioning, telling your story. What are you looking for? How can working with your suppliers to be able to help support some of the efforts that you're trying to undertake with regards to meeting water objectives and requirements that you set in establishing those water stewardship principles. So, organizations really need to realize they're at risk if they're not generating water data both internally and throughout the supply chain. So definitely from an operational standpoint, working with that supply chain is going to be key for you to be able to realize some of the aspirations that you have regarding water stewardship. So some of the actions an organization can take is, well, typically there's other certified system certification. We just talked about WAVE. We talked about Alliance for Water Stewardship at the onset of this activity. You might be able to integrate some of those recording and things that you're doing with regards to water, with regards to some of the evaluation systems out there, CDPs out there, CEO water mandates, sustainability consortium. Many of these bodies have ways that you can report some of the water things that you're doing and be able to craft a message that sends a story to your customers, as well as the people that use your product, to be able to show what and demonstrate the credentials that you're developing with regards to water stewardship. We want to make sure that an organization starts to do some things with integrating this. Dylan mentioned this earlier, integrating it with your strategic business planning, your business development activities, any capital expenditures, continual improvement activities. Start to look at water and let that become a component of the things that you do, but integrate that into some of the things that you're doing from the rest of the business as well. It shouldn't be standalone. It should be an integral part of the development and the systems that you develop. Sometimes it's good to be able to develop water stewardship in the context of some of these reporting frameworks, like I mentioned earlier. They have some good methodology that you can incorporate into your existing systems to be able to capture some of the things that you're doing and working on with regards to water stewardship. But really, there might be some things in there. So you might say, how do I know how to do all this stuff? Well, there's some sustainability planning programs out there that might be able to help you not only understand water, but also understand, where would I stand from an ESG standpoint? Where do I stand from sustainability, with all those different components of sustainability, like we talked about carbon as well. Well, there's program efforts out there. There's a program that we lead, that's called 21st Century Pathways. So whether it be custom or part of a larger group, that helps companies to be able to understand that organizationally and be able to see, how do I fit these pieces together within my organization to make things work? How do I incorporate water stewardship into what I'm doing to make sure that it becomes part of the daily lexicon of what we do organizationally and operationally? And how do we communicate that effectively to not only internal stakeholders, but external stakeholders and shareholders potentially as well?
So we've tackled a pretty big topic in a pretty short period of time. A few concluding points that I think are really important to take away. The first is that companies in all sectors all over the globe are facing water risks that impact their businesses. And if they're not yet, they likely will in the future. And it's not just the Southwestern United States where they're experiencing severe droughts. It's Wisconsin, it's the Midwest, it's places where water might even be abundant, right? So these water risks are really diverse, and it's important that we understand how we use the resource, how the watershed that we're operating in presents different challenges to the way that we're dependent upon the resource and how we use that resource, and set some targets and strategies that are contextual and responsive to and aligned with water stewardship, responsive to risks and aligned with water stewardship. So what we really want to do is guide companies away from traditional water management to this more holistic water stewardship approach. And so we offered very quickly a number of different ways to do that. If this is something that your company or a company that you're working with is exploring, we're happy to have discussions with regard to where you're at in your water journey and how we can support and meet you wherever you are in that journey. Water strategy development is really important, and implementation of good water stewardship at the operational scale is really important. But again, it's a journey, right? Continual improvement is key. Traditional water management is great. We love to see conservation and efficiency goals that get companies on a path to doing something meaningful about water, but we want to see it evolve over time. And water stewardship sort of offers the next step in the maturity of addressing water resources. The Water Council, WMEP, Wisconsin Sustainable Business Council, we have a number of different ways that we can support you in this journey. So please do reach out to us. We're happy to support you, and again, meet you wherever you are in your water journey. With
well,
that,
and I did see a question in the
Q&A. We got a couple. So here's our information. Again, please write it down. Feel free to reach out to us, even if it's just with questions or seeking some guidance. We do have a few minutes left here, and we do have a few questions. So I will go through these quickly, and then we will conclude. The first is just a logistical question with regard to the slide deck being made available. We won't share the deck itself, but this is a recorded webinar. And so we will make the recording available to all attendees. We will also send up a follow-up email that will include the recording to the webinar, as well as some follow-up materials for everybody. Greg, there's a question, maybe we can both answer this. There's a question in here with regard to just some additional examples of how we've seen water risk materialize in the different maybe approaches that companies have taken to be responsive to those. I'll offer a couple quickly that I think are interesting. One is from the water quality perspective. I was working with a company that was just business as usual. From a regulatory perspective, they were meeting their permit. They were discharging effluent to a creek, treating that effluent prior to discharge. But over time, nitrates became a bigger issue in their watershed. They weren't really in tune with the new emphasis on nitrates. And so over time, they learned that their discharge to the watershed was ultimately having some impact on the nitrate issue in the surface water. And so they had to be very reactive then to how they addressed that issue. It led to some reputational damage. It made it into the press. The water stewardship approach is designed to help a company get ahead of that regulatory curve, that reputational risk, to understand what are the watershed conditions, to understand how am I using and discharging the water, what is my discharge makeup made of, and could it potentially pose some risk to me in the future, and can I implement something now to be resilient to that risk materializing? So that's one example. On the quantity side of things, another site, Withdrawing had a provision of water resources. There was a local water availability supply plan in place. And so they're withdrawing the resource. Watershed seems to be relatively water abundant, haven't had any major drought issues, but there is significant population growth. It's putting significant demand on the water availability, and future projections actually show that the availability of the resource will not meet demand. So while they live in a watershed that feels really immune to water quantity related risks, future projections actually show that they may need to reconsider how much water they're using, or that some reduction mandates could come down the pike. So they're getting ahead of that, right? They're thinking about how can we be resilient to that future water quantity condition. What sorts of things can we do now to be more efficient, to demonstrate to stakeholders that we are being an engaged member of proactively resolving that issue. So that's an example from a quality and quantity perspective. Greg, I don't know if you have another one to offer.
Yeah, I do. And actually, this is a reputational risk. And this is with a water bottling plant that we did work with, and they wanted to expand their operations. And let me just give a very brief background on it. They worked very hard with with stakeholders. So with those people in that geographical area that were impacted where they had their bottling location, and they had a very good rapport with them. So they were very transparent in the things that they were talking about and things that they were doing. They had built a good relationship. Well, they were having an open forum to talk about the expansion of the operations that they were planning on doing. And they had some members of the media there, and the media people were trying to, I'm not going to bash the media, but they were trying to, really challenge and be contrarian to what was going on. And what was impressive was the stakeholders actually stood up and told the media people, no, you're wrong. We support this. We want this because we know the working relationship we have with this organization. So, and what that did was it told the organization they really invested where they needed to, working closely with their stakeholders, being very upfront and transparent in the things that they were doing, building those relationships, to have people that were community leaders and thought leaders in that geographical area supporting the business to expand their operations, to say, no, that isn't true. This is, we want this. We think this is valuable, and we believe that the company is working with us. So an example of reputational, also with collaborative, because that business had to, you have to make some effort to be able to, build those relationships with stakeholders that you've identified as key. And that's something that, many organizations typically haven't done in the past. So as you go down your water stewardship journey, we want people who are aligned with us, that understand what we're doing, to, bounce ideas off and get some more information and gather support. And in this instance, it really helped out this business to expand their operation.
Great example. Final question here is with regard to where you can get more information with regard to the things that we've been talking about today. Again, I'll send a follow-up email to all attendees and registrants that includes the recording of the webinar. We can include some links to some of the different offerings and tools that we've discussed over the course of the day today. And again, if you have any additional questions that arise in the future, take down our information, please do reach out to us. We're happy to have a discussion with you. With that, I think we'll wrap. We're at time. Hopefully you took something away from this, have a better understanding for water stewardship, for water risk, and please be in touch with us in the future. Greg, anything to conclude?
Thank you for your participation. We appreciate it, and we're here to help if you have any questions along your journey. So know that there's some people out there. You don't have to go it alone.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
I know.